That's how much of your income comes from one single customer, your employer, as we would call it. We call that in our society job security, but if you ran a business and you had one customer and that controlled 100% of your revenue, you wouldn't call it security, you'd call it dangerous. So today we're going to talk about how we would go about fixing that without quitting your day job. So as an employer, how I can get rid of it being a 100% of my income deal. Without inventing some brilliant idea, by the way, we're not going to do that. And without also becoming an internet entrepreneur or some other kind of entrepreneur. So we're going to deal with that today. I'm Dale Callahan. I direct the engineering management program at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and I've spent my career leading technical people. This is the Company of One podcast, and here's where we talk about turning what you already know into more income, more options, and most importantly, more control. So let's start here. You may have a good job, maybe even a great job, good pay, good title, people respect what you do. None of that changes the math though. If one customer generates 100% of your income, that customer sets your price, sets your hours, sets your future, sets everything, right? They can change your role overnight. They can change your team. They can change their mind about you entirely in one meeting, one phone call. And there's nothing in your contract that guarantees that they won't. Matter of fact, most of you don't have such a contract at all. You just have an employment agreement. You have watched this happen. I'm just guessing you've watched this happen many times. A reorg moves through your department, and the titles and the people that felt permanent are gone in a week, right? We've all seen this happen in some way or another. A budget line may get cut, and the decision has nothing to do with how good the work was. A new leader, comes in with a new set of favorites, and years of performance reviews stop mattering. None of that means your employer is doing something wrong. That's the first thing we want to do is blame them. That's not true. Most are fine. Most treat people fairly most of the time, but fair and safe are not the same thing. Employers have to do what employers do. They have to take care of the business. You're not the business. You're a tool to help them get the work done. You see, a single point of failure is still a single point of failure, even when it's a nice one. And in your case, the single point of failure is 100% of your income tied to one employer. So here's what we often hear is, I would call the myth. Here's where most people go next with this, right? When I say these kind of things. They hear second source of income and their brain jumps straight to, well, I need to start a business. So they think about quitting. They think about some big idea, a big leap. They think about building a course, an app, a brand, a business. They picture a logo, a website. Sometimes they get excited, sometimes they get scared, right? They may even go after a business partner, but because usually that's a fear right there. None of that feels realistic right now with a mortgage and the kids and the job that already takes 50 hours a week. They do nothing, right? All this is just pie in the sky. And that's the trap. The gap between employer is my only customer and a full-blown entrepreneur feels so big that people freeze in the middle of it. And it's a pretty big gap, to be fair, especially when you've never done this before. You don't need to close that gap in one jump. You need one small, boring step. As a matter of fact, you don't need to close that gap ever if that's what you want to do. But you do need to change the 100% game. But this hits harder if you're a technical person. So if you're an engineer or you lead technical people or you're a computer scientist, whatever you are, right? Any kind of technical person, it could be a financial analyst. This hits harder than it is for most. You see, we tend to be trained as technical people, we're systems people. You're trained to trust systems. Follow the process, hit the milestones, get the review. The system takes care of you, right? That's the feedback loop, right, as we see in the engineering world. That training served you well inside a project plan. It has not served you well when it comes to your income, because your income is not a system. It's a relationship with buyers. And usually that's where technical people, we struggle, is the relationship, and money is about relationships. So you would never design a piece of infrastructure, for instance, with a single point of failure and call it done. When we write code, we have things to protect things. When we build bridges, we have safety factors built in. No matter what we do, we don't have single points of failure if we can help it in any way, right? We add redundancy, a backup, a second path. Your income deserves the same design standard you would apply to anything else you stake your reputation on. Here's the goal I want you to aim at instead. Not a business, not a resignation letter, $500, right? Earn $500 outside of your employer. I mean, you pick a number. $500 is a good solid number from somebody who is not your employer paying you for something you already know how to do. That's it. That's the whole first goal. $500 doesn't replace your salary. It's a blip, right? $500 does something, though, that's more than replacing your salary. It proves a fact, and it proves it to you. It proves your employer is not the only party on earth willing to pay for what's in your head. Once you've proven that fact, everything else about your situation starts to change. Even if your job stays exactly the same and you enjoy doing your job, you stop negotiating from fear because you're not stuck anymore. You see options. You stop absorbing every unreasonable request because you know it's your only option. That shift happens the moment the first $500 lands. Not when you've built something big, but when you've proven the idea works at all. So how do you actually get there? 3 steps. Not complicated, just ignored because they're, not exciting. Step 1. Identify one problem you already know how to solve. Not a new skill, not a certification that you got hanging on the wall, not something you'll learn someday that you need to go do. Something you already do today that people struggle with. If you're an engineer, that might be reading a spec nobody else can parse through. If you're operations, that might be untangling a process that's quietly wasting money. If you manage people, that might be running a meeting that actually ends on time with a decision made. Boy, wouldn't that be awesome? Somewhere in your current job, there's a problem you solve so easily you've stopped noticing it's a skill. All those things I just mentioned are examples of skills, right? And valuable ones for obvious reasons. You see, that's usually where people miss it. The skill feels too obvious to sell because it's too easy for you. Step 2, find one person or one company already filling that problem. Not a market, not an audience. One person. It's probably somebody you know, a former coworker, a vendor you've dealt with, a small company down the road that clearly doesn't have anyone doing what you do, your brother-in-law's company. It doesn't matter. Think about who has complained to you about this exact problem in the last year. Somebody has, guarantee it. Write down that name. You're not launching a product. You're finding one person with a pain that you can solve. Step 3, offer a small, clearly defined result. Not a retainer, not a partnership, not let me know if you ever need help. Boy, that's the thing that I hear all the time is let me know if you need help. As I'm sitting here saying that. That means nothing. You've got to take the ball and do something with it, right? You need one result, one price, one deadline that you give them. Something like, I'll review your process and hand you 3 fixes by Friday for $500, right? Maybe that's not a terrible way to say that, but is concrete. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to hand you. Here's the deadline. Here's the amount. Or something like, I'll take your spec and turn it into something your team can actually build from by next week. $500. Specific enough that they know exactly what they get. Small enough that saying yes is easy. That's a customer. That's your second customer. And your employer just lost their monopoly on your income. And that's a great feeling for you. So a few things you're probably thinking right now. I've done this hundreds, thousands of times with people, and I can feel the questions. I can feel it coming from you. So let's deal with them directly. Number one, what if you don't have a skill worth paying for? I get that one all the time. And the more seasoned, expertise, higher paying the person, the more likely I am to get that question. It's weird. So, but first of all, you do. You do have a skill worth paying for. You've just been paid for it by a salary instead of an invoice. And it doesn't feel like a product, but it still is a product. It's still that product that's valuable. There it is. Somebody's already paying you for it. What about my non-compete or employer finding out? Okay, that's real. Read your actual agreement, if you have one, before you assume the worst. Most employers just are restricting you from competing with your employer, right? We don't want you going out serving our competitor and telling them things that we do inside, right? That seems fair. But they're not usually doing anything where it's saying that you're not helping an unrelated company with a general skill. For instance, if you write software for an insurance company and you go out there and help your friend who owns a vet office and write some software to help them, it's totally unrelated, right? It's not a conflict. They don't own your skills. They don't own everything in your head. They just own the work that you do for them. So pick a problem and a customer clearly outside your employer's lane and remove most of the risk before you start. But so all that said, sometimes they don't care. There are some companies that actually support you going and doing other things. I mean, probably not if it's a direct competitor. They have lines, but they're very, very supportive of it. So don't assume your company is not. And just because your boss says, oh, you can't do that, go look. Now, the third question I get is, what if nobody says yes? Then you've learned something for free, right? You've learned that the way you've worded that or what you're offering is not valuable, at least, or you're offering it to the wrong person, right? So you just adjust the offer, or you find a different person and you try again. The goal was never a guarantee. The goal is to get to proof. And so you might have to play with this a little bit, right? Just like your first day in the job. You didn't know how to do everything. You figured it out. But if you look back at the bigger picture, here's what most people miss about that first $500. It's never about the money. I'm just randomly picking $500 as a number. I could just as easily pick 200 or 1,000 or whatever it is. But once somebody outside your job pays you, you learn things you can't learn any other way. You learn what people will actually pay for versus what you assume they'd pay for. You learn what took you 5 minutes but felt like magic to them. That's when you've got something, right? When you're like, that's so stupid obvious. Why is that valuable? And they're jumping up and down thinking that's the coolest thing in the world. I've had that experience many times, and I'm always baffled, like, really? But that's the way it works. That's why your expertise is your expertise. You see, you learn where the real opportunity is because they'll tell you, usually without meaning to, right? But you'll see there's that opportunity. That first small job is about how you find the second job and the third job. And it's how a one-time $500 project turns into recurring revenue. It's how you go from one customer to two. One engineer I know spent a year fixing the same reporting mess inside of his own company, just untangling it, right? When a former colleague at a different company mentioned the exact same kind of headache they were having, different industry, just, same kind of headache. He offered to rebuild their report, their system, for $500 because he's done it. It was the same software, everything, right? So 2 weeks later, that same company asked him to do it for 2 more departments. And then a few months later, I think it was like 6 months later, that one $500 favor was paying him more. Some months more than his overtime did. Nothing about his job had changed. What changed is he stopped being 100% dependent on it. So here's the only thing I would want you to do after this episode. If you're sitting here with me, this is what I would ask. Don't quit your day job. Some people get excited and that's just where they go. Don't. That's just not the right path here. That's not. Just don't. Don't build a website tonight. Don't get all excited and pull up and build a website. Don't go try to solve this in one weekend and then get discouraged if it doesn't work. Pick one problem you already know how to fix. Pick one person already stuck in it and go offer them a small, clearly defined result. They may say yes, they may say no, they may ask more questions. You're just getting in a conversation, right? Your employer has been your only customer for your entire career, whether it's this current one or a past one, right? But that was never a rule. It's just a habit you got into, and it's kind of what we train in the education system, right? It's a terrible, terrible policy, terrible plan. You already know how to break it. If you want a simple way to work through what's actually holding you back from that first step, I put together a free resource called Moving Past Obstacles. You'll find it at dalecallahan.com and the show notes below. And I am Dale Callahan, and this has been the Company of One.